All right, folks. Well, welcome. Thanks to all of you for coming out. This is going to be, I think, a very interesting and fun discussion here tonight. I'm Tom Carrico, and on behalf of the Center for the Study of American Democracy, welcome. I want to do a couple things tonight. First, I see a couple friends in the audience. In the first instance, the godmother of the center, that's Pam Jensen. Thank you. Great to see you as always. Also see some friends from Ashland. Thank you all from coming down the road. So tonight is our Constitution Day event. Yesterday was formally Constitution Day. By law, we have 1 week on the other side of it. And this evening, we're going to talk about Washington and Hamilton and kind of their relationship. And for that, we have a good friend of mine, actually, that I've been trying to get here for campus for a while now, and we finally got him here. He's a friend of mine, but also a friend of Kenyon. He's been here for the last couple years, actually, teaching in the summer program, the Kenyon Institute. But also, as it turns out, and you'll hear in a moment his bio, but one of his first books he wrote in the basement of the Kenyon Library some years ago on sabbatical here. Before I turn it over to that, I want to do a couple things, one of which is to thank one of our sponsors for this evening, and that's the Jack Miller Center. They help sort of sponsor Constitution Day events all over the country. And also to give you a brief commercial. Next week, we have a big conference on campus. I hope you may have seen some of these signs around campus. We've got really, I think, a very rich lineup of folks to come and talk about free speech and civil discourse, two ideas that are sometimes in tension with one another. And to discuss these things, I think we've got just sort of a blue ribbon lineup. We've got Eugene Volokh. We've got Nadine Strawson, former president of the ACLU. Eugene Volokh is from UCLA School of Law. We've got Allison Stanger, who you may have heard of from the Middlebury College episode earlier this year with Charles Murray. We've got Jeff Rosen, the head of the National Constitution Center, who's going to kick us off actually next Wednesday night on September 27. We've got Steven Pinker, a very renowned psychologist from Harvard. We've got Heather McDonald, Greg Lukianoff, Laura Kipnis, Shadi Hamid, Stanley Fish, Howard Dean, Teresa Bejan, Ulrich Bayer, John McWhorter, and two alums, Paul Singer from USA Today and Stephanie Freiberg. So it's, I think, going to be a great 2 days, September 27, 28. So I hope you come back for some of that stuff. I think it's going to be a very rich discussion. So to introduce our speaker formally, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Stupaka, who's a junior international studies major. Thank you all.
Stephen F. Knott is a professor of national security affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Prior to accepting his position at the War College, Knott co-chaired the Presidential Oral History Program at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. His books include Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth, Secret and Sanctioned Covert Operations in the American Presidency, and Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America. Professor Knott was designated a National Hamilton Scholar in January 2017 by the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society for his outstanding scholarship, research, and writing on Alexander Hamilton. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Knott.
Thank you all. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Andrea, wherever you are. It's always a thrill to come back to Kenyon. I honestly believe that this is one of the prettiest campuses in the United States. Ashland's in the running as well. But it's a joy. And as Tom mentioned, I actually did write my first book on Alexander Hamilton during the 1999-2000 academic year. So I was here for Y2K. We were all expecting the planes to fall out of the sky and the water to stop running, et cetera, et cetera. But that's when I first fell in love with Kenyon. So it always is a joy to return. So I'm going to talk to you tonight, and I want to thank you for coming because I know there are plenty of alternatives out there, including Monday Night Football and other distractions. But I want to talk to you tonight about the relationship between George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, which I believe was the most important, the most critical relationship of the founding period. There's usually an assumption, or there's usually a tendency to focus on the interactions between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, or perhaps Jefferson and John Adams. But it's my contention that this relationship between these two figures that you see here was the most vital in terms of creating a strong union and in terms of sort of creating a kind of reverence for the American Constitution, which we are here today to commemorate. Let me begin by noting that it was war that brought George Washington and Alexander Hamilton together. War was their formative experience, and it forged the principles and the practices that would animate their entire public careers. Now, I've never served in combat, but I happen to teach at an institution where many of my students have and will go on to, unfortunately, serve in a combat zone. I'm told that it's a bonding experience like no other. There's nothing else to equal that kind of bond that forges between individuals who are under fire. And Washington and Hamilton experienced that, but perhaps more importantly for our discussion tonight, it was the lessons they learned from that Revolutionary War that would, as I said, animate their entire public careers. Both men were deeply committed to the American Revolution. Obviously, they put their lives on the line for it. But they were revolutionaries who understood the virtues of prudence and moderation. And I would argue this sets them apart from zealots like Thomas Paine and arguably Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to do my best tonight to contain my Jefferson derangement syndrome, which I have a tendency to suffer from, but I'm on medication. So. Paine and Jefferson's theoretical musings veered dangerously close, I believe, to the revolutionaries of modern times who profess an abstract love for humanity, frequently from the confines of a cloistered library, and who envision mankind freed from the strictures of the past and reaching new levels of perfectibility. Washington and Hamilton, on the other hand, never suffered from any illusions about the flawed nature of man, and both stood firmly for reason over passion and for stability over speculative change. And for both men, the rule of law was the gold standard. Now, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, as a young man, first demonstrated his commitment to these principles when he was a 20-year-old student at King's College in New York, which is now Columbia University, when an angry revolutionary mob stormed the house of the college's president, Miles Cooper, who was a Tory sympathizer. Hamilton apparently appealed for calm. Again, keep in mind, he's 20 years old, he's new to this country, long enough to allow the frightened president to escape through a back door. Now, this would be, in my view, the first of many Hamiltonian appeals for reason over passion, a position to which he would adhere to throughout his entire public life. And in many ways, what happened on the steps of Miles Cooper's house epitomized Hamilton's conception of statesmanship, preserving order and holding the forces of passion at bay for as long as possible. Hamilton's devotion to the rule of law can also be seen in a later event from his life, which is when he defended the rights of Tories, those Americans who had supported maintaining the allegiance to the crown. Hamilton defended the rights of Tories in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Hamilton was a prominent attorney in New York City. Hamilton thought that the exodus of Tories from New York and from the United States as a whole would have significant negative consequences on the state and on his nation. Quote, "Our state will feel for 20 years at least the effects of the popular frenzy," he wrote, thinking particularly of the commercial damage done when thousands of entrepreneurs fled the United States for Canada and elsewhere. Hamilton believed that singling out a class of citizens by violating their property rights was a gross infringement of the principles of natural justice and the constitutional rule of law. Moreover, on a more practical level, the seizure of Tory property at the end of the American Revolution broke some of the treaty clauses in the Paris Peace Treaty, which had ended the war between the United States and Great Britain only months before. And Hamilton argued that America, now that it was an independent nation, must act, quote, in a manner consistent with the dignity of that station. And he told his friend, Gouverneur Morris, the things we are doing now we ought not to do. Instead of wholesome regulations for the improvement of our polity and our commerce, we are laboring to contrive methods to mortify and punish Tories and to explain away the Paris treaties. During the spring of 1784, Hamilton publicly represented a Tory in a case that was as much a risk to his position and to his reputation as John Adams's decision to defend the Redcoats in the Boston Massacre. And the case I'm about to tell you about is called Rutgers versus Waddington. Elizabeth Rutgers was an 80-year-old widow who had fled the British occupation of New York City in 1776 and abandoned her brewery and alehouse. A couple of British merchants, including Benjamin Waddington, had taken over the brewery at the initiation, or the instigation, I should say, of the British Army and operated it for the duration of the war. Waddington and his partner did not pay any rent from 1778 until 1780. They even made improvements to the property and paid rent after 1780 to the British Army according to the law of nations. 2 days before Washington and his army reoccupied New York City, a fire destroyed the property. Mrs. Rutgers sued Waddington for £8,000 under the Trespass Act. In June 1784, Alexander Hamilton, representing Waddington, representing the Tories, appeared before the mayor's court of the city of New York and presented his arguments in the case. Hamilton argued that the Trespass Act was invalid because it violated the laws of war. New York incorporated common law, which included the law of nations, which in turn included the laws of war and permitted Waddington's actions. I realize this is a little complicated, but I'll get to my main point quickly here. Secondly, under the Articles of Confederation, only Congress had the authority to make treaties, which the states were bound by the Confederation to follow. New York, therefore, had to respect the rights of Tories. The young attorney also made the first of his many arguments for judicial review of legislative acts. And as we will see later, it's Hamilton's thinking on judicial review that profoundly influences John Marshall, the great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Hamilton quoted Cicero in this case to say that when two laws conflict, the fundamental law trumps the ordinary law. The court also invalidated a legislative act if the majority were acting tyrannically. They should invalidate an act if the majority were acting tyrannically over the minority by violating the rights of a minority group. In mid-August, the court in New York rendered its decision and they split the difference. Although it did not invalidate the Trespass Act, the court also did not award the sympathetic elderly widow full damage. The decision, perhaps most importantly, accepted Hamilton's reasoning about the laws of nations. Mrs. Rutgers won damages for the use of her property for 2 years when the rent went unpaid, and she eventually settled the case for £800. Now, the New York press and the New York legislature harshly criticized Hamilton's role in this case. He was excoriated for arguing on behalf of the Tories. Nevertheless, he would continue representing them in some 70 cases over the next few years. When George Washington received a copy of the decision involving his former protege, he stated that, quote, reason seems very much in favor of it. Common sense and reason were the foundation of all law and government, Washington argued, which he thought was noticeably absent from the Articles of Confederation Congress. And there's a political student of political theory, Michael Federici, who has argued that Hamilton's defense of the Tories was one of several instances when he sacrificed popularity for what he perceived to be the greater good. A habit of conduct, I would add, that attributed or contributed to, as much as any factor, the perception that he, Hamilton, was not a Republican and in fact possessed a certain affection for the British Empire. And that accusation would dog Hamilton throughout his career, public career. So let me, excuse me. Sorry. Here we go. So this notion that Hamilton was not fully Republican, not fully part of, or had not fully embraced the spirit of 1776, has surrounded him from day one. And part of the reason for this is that neither Washington nor Hamilton shared the growing belief within the ranks of the Jeffersonians that the people always reasoned correctly, and that the cure-all for the problems of a republic was more democracy. This also explains some of the ongoing hostility toward Hamilton, and to a lesser extent, George Washington. Washington still holds a kind of special place to the extent that the American public thinks about their founding. But Hamilton, at least up until about 2 years ago, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, and by the way, we can certainly talk about that if you wish. Throughout much of our history, Hamilton has been seen as a negative influence, as a kind of, I like to say, the Darth Vader of the American founding. That's one of my more scholarly observations. Hamilton's candor regarding the failings of public opinion stand in contrast to the feel-good rhetoric of Thomas Jefferson, who wrote more often about the wisdom of the American people. Although it should be noted that even here, sometimes Jefferson's rosy rhetoric is highlighted at the expense of some private comments that are much more critical of the public and public opinion. Many of the same scholars who are inclined to see Hamilton's skeptical attitude toward public opinion as evidence that he was a closet authoritarian, or perhaps even worse, are still, they still, I would argue, perhaps even dominate the American Academy. I actually heard a speech that Joseph Ellis gave. You may be familiar with Ellis. He's written a number of award-winning books on American history. And in January, I was watching C-SPAN, and I was starting to nod off a little bit, but he said something that woke me up immediately and startled my dog, who was sitting in my lap. Ellis said that had Hamilton had his way, the United States may very well have become a totalitarian dictatorship. And it's astounding to me, and again, we can get into this in the question and answer period, but that reputation still is out there, and I think it's quite misguided. Now again, as part of the reason, I think part of the explanation for this is that the Federalist position, particularly as argued by Hamilton, may seem to modern sensibilities excessively critical of the public and of the public's ability to reason. Hamilton wrote, quote, "The public sometimes errs, and that while the people intend to do right by the common good, they do not always reason right about the means of promoting it." Now this was partly due, in Hamilton's view, to the ability of demagogues to flatter the people, which presented a constant threat in a republic. Demagogues, by appealing to public prejudices, were able to lead the people to betray their true interests. And both Washington and Hamilton believed this and were aware that the forces of populism at work in their day would allow for what Hamilton would call every sudden breeze of passion and temporary delusions to overcome or overpower reason as a guide for the policies of this new government under this new Constitution. Hamilton and Washington believed, as they put it, that the deliberate sense of the community should govern, notice deliberation, and that this was possible only through a government that allowed for cool and sedate reflection. There would be times when statesmanship would require that the president resist the wishes of the people. At its core, this is what Washington and Hamilton's federalism was about. And I believe this is what was slowly but surely undone by the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian movements of the first half of the 19th century. And this task was completed, in my view, by the progressive movement of the early 20th century. The Federalist Moment that these men presided over was a brief one. It lasted only from 1789 to 1797, when Washington left the presidency at the end of his second term. But to some extent, it carried over briefly, to some extent, during the presidency of John Adams, when Adams kept Washington's cabinet in place, and those cabinet members responded more to Hamilton than they did to President Adams. But this critical period, the larger point being this critical period, allowed the new federal government to secure its footing, to stabilize the nation's finances, and to avoid war with the leading superpower of the day. I'm referring to the Jay Treaty with Great Britain. That none of this would have happened without George Washington is almost unanimously accepted. What is less, or far less, universally accepted is that Hamilton was critical to this as well. This man was this man's closest advisor, and it drove Thomas Jefferson crazy. And we can talk about why Washington and his fellow Virginian Jefferson did not tend to see eye to eye on the great policy questions, whereas this man who came from an obscure island in the Caribbean somehow bonded with this man who was old enough to be his father, and they came from two completely different economic and cultural backgrounds, and yet somehow they were able to put that aside and forge, I believe, a new nation. Washington's intuitive judgment, I've kind of given short shrift to Washington here and focused more on Hamilton, but Washington's intuitive judgment, or today we might call it emotional intelligence, was far superior to Hamilton's. So much of what I just spoke about doesn't happen without Washington. As Hamilton says when Washington passes away, this man was an aegis, a shield, absolutely essential to me. So none of Hamilton's policy proposals as Secretary of the Treasury, none of that happens without Washington's shelter, in a sense. Washington, as the modern expression would say, was comfortable enough in his own skin not to be intimidated by Hamilton, unlike some of the other founding fathers, unfortunately. Washington saw qualities and talents in Hamilton that were unnoticed, or more often than not, resented by other members of the founding generation. This was particularly true in the area of economics and finance, where Hamilton was constantly struggling against the forces of superstition and ignorance. But it is also true in matters of law and international relations, where Hamilton was remarkably well-read and a profoundly original thinker. The great Chief Justice John Marshall, whom I mentioned earlier, was once quoted as saying that Hamilton's reach of thought was so far beyond Marshall's, that by Hamilton's side, Marshall felt like a schoolboy. It is not too much of a stretch to proclaim, and I would proclaim it, that Hamilton was a genius at what he referred to in the Federalist Papers as the science of politics. Now, don't get me wrong, he was a horrible politician, as the duel with Burr, and we can get into that in the question and answer period. But as a nation builder and a strategic thinker, he was without parallel. Hamilton was able, as historian Darren Staloff has noted, to transform the federal government from an abstract constitutional frame into a concrete political reality. Fortunately for the United States, Hamilton had studied politics, and I'm stealing here from John Adams, so that Hamilton's children might study mathematics and philosophy, and his grandchildren painting, poetry, and music. And again, let me reiterate that George Washington shared Hamilton's view, shared this strategic vision, wanted to implant, in a sense, in the American people this notion that they needed to begin to think of themselves as Americans, not as Virginians, not as New Yorkers, but as Americans. And that, in my view, may have been one of their most, if not the most important accomplishments. But both men shared this view, this flawed view of human nature, which led them to where I began, to believe in the rule of law. And you can see this, by the way, in Washington's very early during the American Revolution, a mob of New Yorkers, including some members of the Continental Army, tore down a statue of King George III in Battery Park in New York City. And while that event was widely praised and celebrated throughout the colonies, Washington was not pleased. For him, this kind of mob action was precisely what the American Revolution was not supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about the rule of law, and he actually issued orders to his army telling him that never again in the future should any members of the Continental Army participate in such an action. So the rule of law was the essential element for the nation that both of these men fought to establish. In conclusion, let me note that throughout their 22-year alliance, and they really were only together from the spring of 1777 until Washington's death in December 1799, throughout their brief 22 or so year alliance, both of these men would be shot at, literally and figuratively, from both sides, from all sides. They drew this fire partly because their wartime experience, as I said to you earlier, set them apart from many of their founding brethren, some of whom developed, as I also said, an abstract armchair radicalism, dangerously, in the view of these men, dangerously divorced from the cold reality of revolutionary death and destruction. Washington and Hamilton saw death up close and personal and understood that there was a thin veneer separating order from chaos. And this led them to embrace the virtue of moderation and to revere stability. So they were sober revolutionaries, and thankfully so, I believe, for due to them, the American Revolution did not consume itself, unlike most modern revolutions that have a tendency to turn in on themselves and become orgies of violence. It was a close call, but because of Washington and Hamilton, the United States escaped this fate. So I would much rather take questions from you, and I'm going to conclude my formal remarks at this point. Thank you for listening.